Yeah. Please don't.
Good morning and welcome everyone. I want to welcome you back to the ARC, and we have about a dozen folks joining us virtually. We're going to hope that all of this works seamlessly this morning, but as we know how technology can be, I want to thank the team today that took the time to get us set up for the meeting today. I'm excited to welcome everyone back. This is our very first meeting in person in 2 years. If you all recall, in 2019, we had recently kicked off the TDMCC. And in March of 2020, after only having about 2 or 3 meetings, we went home for the pandemic. And so we haven't been in a room with each other since 2019. And so I'm really excited on today. We've got a really robust agenda, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But I do want to welcome all of you to our in-person meeting. Our next slide is just a recap of our agenda for our own online folks. Today, we've got a really good lineup here. We're going to have a legislative update by John Bayales. Bennett Foster and Joel Washer are going to come and talk about TriTransit. And we will have a TDM plan update from Sabrina and Tracy Celine with the ICF team. But before we get into that, I do want to note that the February 15th meeting minutes were posted to the ARC website. And I'd like to ask if there are any changes or updates to those meeting minutes. If not, the meeting minutes will stand as is. Thank you all so much. Jill, do we have any public comment for this morning?
No public comment today.
Awesome. Thank you kindly. So at this time, without further delay, I'm going to turn it over to Bennett Foster and Joel Washer, and they're going to come and present to you regarding TriTransit.
Just drive right here.
Right here.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Good morning, those of us joining us virtually. So my name is Bennett Foster, Manager of Employer and Outreach Engagement. And I'm joined by Joel Washer, Manager of Marketing Communications for Georgia Commute Options. Just really briefly, we're going to talk about TriTransit. And for those who don't know, TriTransit's a regional promotion led by GCO. Our goal is to shift commuters from driving alone to taking transit by removing barriers and the costs associated with those barriers. So we essentially give folks free transit passes and provide custom transit trip plans. So eligible commuters, they have to, so eligible commuters are based on commuting by transit no more than once a week and must have a viable transit accessible commute. This is my first time talking to a group of people in a long time. So, and virtually. So this is a new one for me. So this is fun. Now the primary thing that we get out of TriTransit, aside from spreading the love of transit to the region, is collecting some information that's useful for both our regional TDM program as well as our fellow transit agencies. And so with our data collection, we have a pre-survey, which is basically our registration form where people sign up. We determine their eligibility and viability. And then we have a 2-week post-survey, which helps us measure utilization. And then we have a used to be a 4-month post-survey. It's now a 2-month post-survey. And that manages long-term behavior change. I'm sorry, that measures long-term behavior change. So I had this plan, thought we might have a full room. I was going to ask who all took transit today, but I think a lot of people telework. Look at this. Whoa, all right. Who all took transit pre-pandemic? Okay, interesting. Okay, so this will be interesting. Virtually, for those who couldn't see that, about half the room raised their hands. A little less than half raised their hands to the first question. More than about half raised their hands to the second question. So I just want to step back to 2019, pre-pandemic, and we have some figures up here. So this was TriTransit 2019. May have also gone by the name Get On Board. So we had about 3,000 registrations in 2019. Of those, we had about 18 who were eligible, and then 14 received passes. And so you can see the distribution here on the chart. All of our ESO, GSO, GCO, and ESO territories, as well as the passes that were distributed. Some of the information we collect in that registration form or that pre-survey is home and work location. With this, we could do some split level analysis, but you also just see the home location and work locations. And this will be very important as we get to the post-survey analysis. We also saw in 2019, just starting in work times, how many days per week people use transit, and what type of mode they use to get to work. This is funny that the presentation kind of got garbled, but that's okay. And we also saw transit access. This is how we measure, this is one of the ways we measure viability. How long are people willing to walk to transit? How far are people willing to walk to transit? And their willingness to use a park and ride. This is the 2-week post-survey data we collect. Out of that, about 40% responded, and you can see what passes they received, the utilization, and now this is all self-reported utilization. So this year we want to get really better at it. And Joe will explain a bit in a moment how we're doing that. And so we also measure their goals. You can't see this here because I expanded it, but strongest motivating factor in the room. Can anyone guess what that 44% is? Because you can't really see it, but what do you think the strongest motivating factor is? Okay, it's something that you may or may not have encountered if you drove in today, but it's avoiding traffic. It's avoiding traffic. The second motivating factor, saving money. So it's going to be really interesting to see this year what these motivating factors are. And then of course, did transit help you achieve that goal? Majority of people said yes. Primary transit usage, because this TriTransit, we can't control how people are going to move around and use their passes. So ideally we want them to use it for their commutes, but really we want them to use it for any kind of trip. As long as they're replacing their car trip, we're very interested in see how they're doing that. And as you can see, majority of people use it for commuting, but let's see what happens this year in our hybrid environment. And would you have commuted without a pass? Half the people said no. So we also measured the transit experience. We asked them how they felt. This is an open-ended question. And so what we did is we just found the salience this year, and we were able to just put these options out there, and of course have another open-ended other question as well. So that was 2019. You know, obviously something happened 2 years ago. We asked our Agile Mile users through the MyGCO app, how did this change? Like, how did your behavior change? Now, there's a lot of information on here, but I want you to look at the far right, planned alternative mode use. More than half of people said that they plan to reduce or just stop commuting by transit. It's kind of like what we saw in this room when you raise your hands. Some folks are not using transit right now. And that's who we really want to focus on this year. Those choice riders. And that's why we're calling this retry transit. Now I know that data is 2 years old. We're going to get a lot of new information this year that we can't wait to share with you. But because of the changes that we've experienced over the last 2 years, we've had to pivot, change our strategy. We've made this campaign more flexible. We are focused on welcoming those commuters back, both current, new, and those choice commuters we want to get back. And we want to support everyone. We were going to be driving more people to the MyGCO app, making sure they understand they could win rewards. They can use, they have all the guaranteed ride home available to them. And now the promotion dates, like I said, we've made it flexible. So this is a rolling promotion. from yesterday to June 30th. We want to empower our local RTMAs because they know their service areas better than we do, and they know what their commuters and their employers need. And so we're working with all those groups. And a big shout out to our transit agencies who are supporting us this year as we want to continue getting more engagement and driving people back to transit. Now I'm going to hand it off to Joel, who's going to tell us a bit more about our strategy. Joel.
I won't get too into the weeds with it, but like Ben said, we're taking this rolling promotion approach. So for reference sake, in the past, it's been a 2-week promotion. It's fairly straightforward to communicate. It's like your, promotion date starts X day, it ends 2 weeks from then. Easy to schedule out your post surveys 2 weeks from that date and 2 months from that date. It gets a little bit more tricky when you're doing it on an ongoing basis, and we still want to maintain and standardize a couple of things. One, having that 2-week promotion period, we want users or transit riders to feel like there's a defined period of time where we're encouraging them to use that pass. We obviously can't like shut it off and make it not work for them anymore, but we want to get as much usage out of that 2-week period as possible. And then we need to standardize those post surveys and make sure that they're being delivered at that same interval of 2 weeks and 2 months, regardless of when somebody's getting their pass or participating. So the way we're solving for that is we're doing this kind of blended automated comms journey that we developed, where the outreach team on the front end can focus on really working with employer partners and then doing data entry of getting people in. And then we use MailChimp and you utilize tags within there. So then they add tags of people eligible, add tags for people who have a viable commute, and then everything kind of cascades from there. So when you create that audience member, they start the journey. It's like, welcome to Retry Transit. Thanks for choosing to ride. Somebody will be in touch if we have a viable commute. Once that viability is determined, they input that as a new tag. That user, it triggers an email saying, hey, great, we found a transit commute for you. And then from that date, we can schedule everything off of that. So then it's your promotion date starts 2 weeks from now. We know when their promotion date's 2 weeks from there. We know when their date ends. And then we schedule the follow-up surveys from there as well. And not too much into this, but we've created a suite of resources for the GCO and TMA partners to utilize if they want. I'm looking at Denise. We know that the TMA partners have their own brands and communicate with their own commuters. This is obviously not prescriptive. We want to provide these as resources for TMAs to draw from as they see fit. So we also have kind of bite-sized pieces that, headers, digital graphics that people can draw from and work into their own materials as they develop theirs. Because as Bennett said, the other tricky part is this has to be flexible from that standpoint too, where everybody's individual promotions are taking place at different times as well. So we're excited to get going. As Bennett said, we'll be launching basically today. We're sending out these materials this afternoon. And we're also developing a photo library. We've had a photographer out the past couple of weeks to just get some transit shots that people can draw from and use in their own materials. So we've heard a number of times that that's something that our partners would find value in. And so we'll be delivering that this week as well. So I think that's it. Oh, and Bennett did say with those post surveys, some of that analysis, the additional piece that we haven't done in the past, we'll be linking that individual pass number. So in previous years, they have to actually go in, see how many rides are left on each individual card. And that's essentially how we measure usage. We may have some access to MARTA data and actually have some TAF data, which will be great. It'll give us much more in-depth looks at how the cards are actually being used. And then the post surveys will actually do individual URLs in each post survey link, so that we can tie those results back to each individual pass so that we can do some geographic analysis as well. But yeah, that's it from us. But you can feel free to reach out to Bennett or I if you have any questions, or if we have any questions now, obviously we can field them, but we'd be happy to help.
All right. Thank you, Joel and Bennett. That was really good presentation. And I also want to mention, I want to give a huge thanks to our regional transit partners. It's because of the transit providers that we have passes to give out. So a huge thanks to Marta, Gwinnett, and the ATL and all the leadership at each of those organizations. We would not be able to do this without them. So we're really proud of this partnership and all the great work that this team has been doing to get this back up and to help support reintegrating folks and reacclimating the region to transit. So thank you so much. Now I want to introduce to you John Bayalis. He is the manager of intergovernmental affairs here at the ARC. I like to call him the governmental guru. And he's going to come and talk to you about the various bills and laws that will potentially impact transportation, and local governments in the region. John Bayalis.
Thank you, Roz. Is on? Is that on now?
Yes.
Okay. I don't have slides today. It's for two competing reasons. One, we did not have a whole lot of transportation legislation down at the Capitol this year during session, which is a first for me, although it certainly alleviated a lot of the typical headaches that go along with being down there for 40 days. Second of all, as it pertains to the investment package, or I'm sorry, the infrastructure package that the federal government passed in November, I don't want to steal any thunder from my colleagues upstairs who are busily, hurriedly working away on a 50 or 60 slide presentation that we're going to whittle down and launch as part of a whole engagement program for stakeholders across the region here relatively soon to talk about unpacking everything that is in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So with that, also, I don't think me rude for keeping my gum in my mouth. I am getting over a cold and I'm trying to avoid having a coughing fit while I'm up here. So if you see me noshing away on my gum, it's because it's for you, not for me. With regard to the state session, so we went sine die on April 4th, a couple Mondays ago. It was still a long day for me, regardless of the lower level of legislation that we were watching. There were a few transportation highlights. I think I'll start right now with the budget. So the state's FY23 budget did include about $16 million in rideshare fees. For those of you that are familiar with the enabling legislation from a couple of years ago, the rideshare fees now get distributed to transit systems across the state. The distribution formula is still being worked out, but that $16 million is about double from what was raised the year prior. It is, of course, much lower than the projected numbers when they enacted that rideshare distribution for transit package a few years ago because of the elephant in the room. COVID, of course, really depleted the use of rideshare across the state. So hopefully we'll see that rebound, but $16 million to transit is $16 million more to transit than the state had ever dedicated prior. So we are always, of course, happy to see that there is something of an annual appropriation to our transit services across the state. Of note with regard to specific legislation, there were two bills I wanted to bring up. One was HB 934. HB 934 went through Ways and Means as it was a tax-related bill. What it does is it extends the collection of special district mass transportation taxes, i.e. maybe one that would be approved by referendum for an ATL district. It extends the collection of those taxes chronologically for the duration of time that is identified on the referendum as opposed to the projected amount. So it had previously been those taxes would be collected and the collections would cease once it hit the projected amount. It will now be collected through the entire duration of whatever the chronology is set forth in the referendum. So just for simple math, if the referendum is set for 5 years, it'll be collected for 5 years. But if that referendum had projected the proceeds would collect $30 million in 5 years, if they had hit $30 million prior to the 5 years, it used to be where they would stop those collections now. So now it'll go through the duration. I'm certainly happy to see that. I think most of you know me well enough to know, given my background in MARTA, I'm intimately familiar with the way costs increase just simply because of inflation, which is, of course, a friendly word right now. So that's I think that's another tool in the toolbox for us to really look critically at how our transit dollars are used. Next and last, really, in terms of any bills of importance regarding transportation, SR 463 was passed. That is the Joint Study Committee on the Electrification of Transportation. So that is a study committee comprised of 11 members, 4 senators, 4 representatives, the GDOT appointment, preferably the commissioner, Georgia Department of Economic Development, and ideally the chairperson of the Public Service Commission. And they will explore all things related to electric vehicles, infrastructure related to electric vehicles, and in all likelihood, how they can have the state take advantage of some of the new funding for EVs and EV infrastructure that's in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act here, which I'll talk about in just a second. One other note on the state side of things I wanted to mention. Less important for you all, although in the grand scheme of things, I think it's significantly important as you go out and kind of figure how you want to interact with legislators and how you want to put together your own legislative agendas and things of that nature. There is going to be a tremendous amount of turnover in 2023, separate from any unexpected losses that may happen to incumbents that are running again in November. We do have a whole host of seats that were vacated as of the end of this session, and some of them were actually vacated while session was still taking place. So we can expect at least 10 new senators, at least 40 new state representatives. Of particular note, we are going to lose our House Appropriations Committee Chairman, Terry England. He's, of course, been very great to work with from an ARC point of view, and I know a lot of folks in here probably interacted with him in the past. That'll be a huge loss. And Senate Rules Committee Chairman Jeff Mullis is also not returning, which is, again, for anybody that is unfamiliar with the legislative process, it's not just about getting your bills out of committee, it's also about getting your bills through the Rules Committee, and Chairman Mullis ran a very tight ship, and we will be sorely missing him as well next session. So we'll obviously sitting on the edge of our seats to find out who takes over for both of those positions. On the federal side of things, before I talk about IIJA, I wanted to mention that the federal government, as is not normally its way, did finally pass a fiscal year budget, fiscal year 22, which of course ended last year. So we have this, or I'm sorry, they were supposed to have passed it last year, prior to September 30th. They didn't get to it. We had a whole series of continuing resolutions through, to the best of my recollection, the middle of March. I think they finally got the budget done. What that did, though, is it obligated the first year of the 5-year package in IIJA. So all of the formula funding that was put forth in IIJA for year 1 of the 5-year plan was included in that package. So we were, of course, extremely happy to see that. What it has unfortunately created is kind of a logjam in understanding where that money is, where those programs are, especially the new programs, and I'll talk about some of that in just a second. So there is kind of a mad scramble now of how best to take advantage of the money that is in there that is not already standard formula funding. For those of us like ARC, we do get standard formula funding, and then that's great, but there are a lot of other new programs that were baked into the bill that, NOFOs are just now being released for those, so on and so forth. So there's a bit of a mad scramble in understanding what the pecking order is going to be for that. They will start work on FY23 appropriations in earnest. That'll probably take up a lot of, hopefully, it'll take up a lot of May and June. And then, of course, they'll go into kind of summer mode and August recess. But hopefully they can cobble together a budget and actually get it passed on time. If nothing else, hopefully they'll get to some sort of minibus package that includes the transportation money again, so we can at least project and plan out well in advance for some of the things that'll be available. On IIJA, of course, as I said, I'm not going to go into a tremendous amount of detail, but I will say it was a landmark bill, $1.2 trillion over 5 years. This is, I think, the 3rd reauthorization package I've been part of. So I was, thrilled to see that this is, in essence, doubling what has ever been done in the past. On standard formula programs, that money doubled as well. So about $570 billion of that 1.2 trillion is dedicated to standard programs, your CIG, Capital Investment Grant Program, things like formula funding for bus programs, so on and so forth. That's all kind of baked in. Roads and bridges, they saw a tremendous increase. Although I felt that that was relatively commensurate with some of the other increases in the other buckets, whether it's transit or pedestrian-friendly programs, things of that nature. I was happy to see that it was a well-rounded bill and well-rounded increases along the way. Some of the value adds, as I mentioned, EV infrastructure is heavily funded. Broadband, there's money for broadband and making broadband available, particularly in rural America and in areas where it is sorely lacking, even in urban zones. Resiliency, water infrastructure, all of these major categories received funding with the other kind of $600 billion. So if you envision the bill, the 1.2 trillion getting cut in half of it was for standard programs that have existed for quite some time. The other half is for some of these new programs. And of course, ARC as an agency is tremendously interested in some of these other value add programs. We do a lot of work in the natural resources space. And we'll, of course, be watching very closely with what happens to the eevee infrastructure and hopefully be able to work with both the state and our congressional delegation on data points around implementing all of that. One other thing I wanted to mention that I think is important for everybody to know with regard to IIJA, there was also a funding bucket included in there, roughly $100 billion that is at the Secretary of Transportation's discretion to invest where he sees fit. That the kind of the primary criteria for that investment funding stream is that the investment can only be made in areas of persistent poverty. So we will be working with our local jurisdictions on identifying projects in areas like that. And of course, hopefully working with the Secretary's office to draw down as much money for projects in those areas as we can for the state of Georgia and for the region. But I think that's a pretty tremendous caveat in the bill. The other point I wanted to make about some of that investment that would be directed by the Secretary himself, he also has the authority under that provision to waive local match, which is, of course, a big deal for organizations like ARC and its member jurisdictions who have to typically come up with about 20% of 100% of the project with local dollars. So if we have projects in areas that we can, really showcase and convince Washington that are worthy of DC investment, we can get up to a full match reduction under that particular funding stream. So with that, I kind of want to leave it at that. Like I said, we have some folks cranking on some much more detailed information. But that's kind of the 50,000 foot. Once again, I really am pleased with that bill. And we have that, in code now for 5 years. Hopefully appropriators see fit to continue appropriating it on an annual basis. And we don't see this continuing resolution thing go on and on and on in perpetuity. Lastly, I wanted to compliment Joel on his Stan Smiths because we clearly are sneaker buddies. So good move. With that, I'll take any questions if anybody has any.
Is there any way for this group to get involved in the EV conversations?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to talk to Roz. And when I think when we figure out exactly, so one of the things we're doing right now is we're scrubbing the bill in a way that we're really trying to identify specifics. So what exactly are their criteria going to be for the grants? Where do those grants overlap with areas that we already serve that have kind of ideas or projects in the pipeline? Would we need to adjust the tip in any way to take advantage of it? All of that kind of stuff. So when we get to a point where we have a very clear idea of where to maximize, not to use a corny term, but where to maximize the bang for the buck, that is, I think, when stakeholders start to get engaged and we start to work through the application process and the implementation process. So, but absolutely, I'll get with Roz and make sure she stays apprised.
Same thing is true on the water side of things, with us all being urban areas. I know particularly Buckhead, there's a lot of water issues sort of down from the commercial core. So we're certainly interested in that.
Absolutely. Jill?
John, there's a couple questions from people joining us virtually. One is, has there been any consideration for bringing back the state tax credit for EVs?
So there was a bill that got a hearing on the Senate side. It was introduced by Senator Elena Parent. I don't recall the number off the top of my head, so forgive me there. But it was a hearing only, which to me, I'm glad that they got it heard. This was the second year of a 2-year session. So, you know, it's nice that the precedent was set, that they heard the bill. And so we may be able to bring that back in subsequent sessions and get that advanced, but it did not advance this year.
And the second question is, which funding is for continuous poverty? I think you mentioned that's the secretary's.
Well, so yeah, it's areas of persistent poverty. So I would have to go back and look at the specific criteria as to what defines an area of persistent poverty. But I believe it's your standard, you know, people living at or below the federal poverty level, so on and so forth. That is where they would take a project and evaluate it against those federal poverty level criteria to see if it would meet the criteria for him to waive the match. So I don't, you know, I don't want to certainly single out any specific areas in the region that might qualify in advance of really having them look at what their needs are and what the secretary may say about that.
Right, thank you.
Yep. All good? Okay. Thank you so much for having me, Russ.
All right, thank you,
Appreciate it.
John. Thank you. John, I think this is yours.
Oh, yeah. My emergency lifeline if somebody while I was up there.
So a huge thank you to John for the update. John did mention, he referenced the team at ARC. John, of course, is on that team, but yesterday, John Orr and team, David Haynes, they hosted a 2-hour sort of a briefing or deep dive, if you will, into all the various aspects of the IIJA, and then started to really unbundle. They did a lot of unbundling in terms of the financial impact and what that looks like, even matched it to our current funding and what that could mean. And there were some buzzwords in there, and I think John said a few of these: climate, CO2 came up a lot, CO2 reduction, congestion mitigation is in there. Equity is all throughout the IIJA, and then eevee. And one of the comments that we made on yesterday was, you know, we already have almost 1,000 corporate partners, and, you know, it could be low-hanging fruit with that process. Maybe not all of them, but potentially. So our eyes are on that. And so I just really sat in and listened in just to see how the dots connect to the work that we do. And there are certainly some connectors. I do want to say as well, I know Hopti's on the line here. We're working closely with GDOT as well, our funder, regarding the IIJA. So we've been really linked up with GDOT, and particularly with Hopti, to look at how we can advance TDM work in the region through this particular funding bill that's in addition to and aside from CMAQ. And so we're extremely appreciative of CMAQ, but IIJA gives us some more room to navigate even more so. So we'll continue to keep you abreast of how that is unfolding as we continue to move forward with that. Yes.
Recording of yesterday's presentation by any chance?
No, because it's still like a planning, so internal, it's an ARC. And
That's what the reference I made. So the deck right now, I'm not lying, is like 60 slides. And that was designed on purpose so we could all absorb all the information in all 60 slides, and then we'll whittle it down for public consumption. So
Gotcha.
You all don't have to whittle through 60 slides.
Okay.
It'll be nice and condensed.
Great.
I will say with that, though, that that is in preparation for a combined TAQC / board meeting, right, John? They're getting ready for a combined meeting with TAQC to present that information to the public. We will be sure to send that information out to you all. That would probably be one of the TAQC meetings you definitely want to sit in on, and that is coming up, I believe, in May. We'll give you the exact date. And so you'll be able to see how all of that got unbundled. Yes.
Hopti mentions that a carbon reduction program is something that they're looking into at GDOT for the good of the group.
Awesome. Fantastic. Just want to mention, I know we have folks here in the room. We've got about 15, 16 of us in the room. There are equally about that same number online, just to kind of give you guys a point of reference. So usually there's about 30 of us in the meeting, so that's a really good thing today. We've got a really great group. And without further ado, I do want to now turn it over to Sabrina Green, who's going to come and introduce the ICF team. I do want to say before they come up, they're going to share with you the review of the survey findings and a brief goal discussion. I don't want to steal their thunder, but you are going to be absolutely amazed when you hear the number of survey responses that we have been able to garner from the TDM plan update. Our research team, you all know Mike Carnathan, he is so intrigued by the number, and he's looking at our processes and the way that we went about creating the strategy for that, for even some of the great work that they do in research. And so I just want to say kudos to this remarkable team today. I want to acknowledge them, Sabrina, Tracy, and her team, for the great work that they've been doing. So I'm going to turn it over to Sabrina Green. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Roz. I'm just going to be up here very briefly. We have a brief status update for you all. As you know, the TDMCC functions as the steering committee for the Transportation Demand Management Plan, which is now named Mobility Connections, a plan for expanding opportunity. And so as the steering committee, we like to give you all, real-time updates of the status of what's going on with the planning process and, major milestones that have been met. And so without further ado, I'll just tee up Tracy, who will discuss in more detail where we landed with the goal statements. But before doing that, I just wanted to remind you all of where we are in relation to our last meeting. So as you can recall, our draft goals were vetted at the February 15th TDMCC workshop. That workshop was primarily dedicated to reviewing goals, but we also reviewed SWOT information and gave you all an opportunity to respond to the analysis that had been done prior to then responding to the drafted goals. From that input, the goal statements were refined. And then we wanted to provide the TDMCC an opportunity to further evaluate and comment on those refined goals. And so we sent out a survey that was open a little over a week from March 30th to April 12th. And that survey gave you an opportunity. It was very brief. Hopefully, most of you had an opportunity to participate in it, but it was literally like thumbs up, thumbs down. And if thumbs down, tell us why. And so we got a few responses. I think in total, we got 11 people to respond to that survey. And the vast majority were happy with the statements as they stood. We did receive some updated information or some recommendations that we then, I think the project team did a really good job at, further refining the goals in response to the feedback that we received. And so I'm going to turn it over to Tracy to just run through where we stand with those goals. I will say after we do this process, our next steps are to meet with our ESOs in the region. So that's our 6 TMA partners as well as GCO, which functions as the ESO for any remaining territories outside of the TMA territories. We'll meet with them and do some individual interviews that will then lead into employer interviews for those areas as well. And then we will get that information to start developing the strategy in relation to these goal statements. And so this is an important step. We are happy to have reached this milestone where we at least have planned goals. And we will give you an opportunity to, give any final comments as we look to move forward in the planning process. So I'm going to take my seat and introduce Tracy Celine, who will discuss the goals.
Sabrina, it's nice to be with everybody in person. It's a small group, but I see familiar faces, so it's good to be in front of you guys again. Just quickly on the goal statements, as you all know from the last workshop that we had, these really, these tend to be the first step in the process. It tends to be a little higher level, fluffier work. But I think that you can see within the goal statements, the culmination of the first round of outreach that we did, not just with the public, but with targeted stakeholders. And you can really start to see like a shift in the focus of the program through these goal statements to broaden who we're serving, how we're serving them, really over a much broader span of employment and industry type, wage profile, et cetera, you name it. So it's about taking what we have, which is a very good, strong program, and getting it out there in front of more people. So also, I hope, in terms of the survey response, we are very pleased with that, just under 13,000. We are hoping that that's a reflection of one of our tenets of this project, which is to really start to drill down communications and messaging through a much broader network, sometimes not transportation related, but certainly interfaces with transit or transportation in some way, shape, or form. And, we spoke to a lot of these groups through our focus groups. We have new relationships, and we're asking them to help us push information out through their networks. And we think this is a big part of the success for the survey. All right. So I have an easy job today because I just get to read you goal statements. All right. So as Sabrina mentioned, we have vetted this with you all a few times. I think we've got them tightened up to where we need to be, but we want to make sure you guys are all comfortable with what you're seeing, because this is the first point in the process where we start to steer the direction of this very big ship that is TDM services in the region. So important first step. Okay, goal 1, support a tailored approach for TDM services that serve a diverse range of social and economic mobility needs. So you see there the first indication of broadening the reach of that program, not just in terms of the type of economic needs we're meeting, but social needs as well. Goal 2, develop TDM services that address workforce development and job training needs. Very specific here. We haven't gotten as specific with goal statements in the past, but there was a need, since most of the strategies right now are focused on job access and retention, to talk about and get on paper the fact that we have an entire employment life cycle that we need to be serving. So it is really refined there to focus on job development, job training. Goal 3, implement TDM strategies that improve first and last mile connections through partnerships with transit agencies and other mobility service providers, filling the gaps. That's what this is about. Goal 4, support TDM strategies that are flexible and tailored to the individual needs of employers and geographic areas. This really builds off of the evaluation framework that was developed a few years ago for Casey's group, where we started to build in this sense of flexibility and tailoring. Local partners know their communities best. How do we reinforce and continue to support that through the plan? Goal 5, support integrated communication strategies across a range of community partners. This is about integrating communications, coordinating, and maximizing the return on our marketing dollar. And goal 6, leverage and diversify funding sources that support measurable and sustainable services and programs. So again, you see sort of this thinking around expanding above and beyond just CMAQ funding. And those are our 6 goals. Roz, anything to say in terms of kind of where we want to take this?
Well, I want to kind of hear from the group to see if you think we got it right. I think we went back and the team worked really hard to refine the first set of goals. So do you all feel that we are closer to what it needs to look like?
On that goal 6, you get the sustainability kind of thing in there, but it's more about our programs being sustainable. Is there any way to make that more of where it's about being part of sustainability in general? I'm not sure if that makes any sense, what I just said. But so much of what we're doing is focused on that sustainability, resilience, ESG. And it's like, that's kind of, you've got the right word in there, but it's almost like it's a different that's saying our programs and services themselves are sustainable from a funding standpoint. Do we have anything that really gets at the broader?
Environmental sustainability component. I think we can think through the wording on that. I think the intent of the goal was really, and this was the one, if you remember, that's largely drawn from the last plan. Because the need hasn't changed to think beyond just CMAQ into other types of innovative funding, not necessarily to push, service the core of the program because we have CMAQ, but to support things like pilot programs and other innovative new strategies that we might want to test. So that was the original thinking. Not just that we needed to have flexible, non-traditional funding sources, but they hopefully are longer term funding sources. So the sustainability focus really was on that temporal aspect. But we can certainly talk about getting more to the environmental component. And maybe that, that might be, if we want to keep this sort of clean and focused on funding, we can re-emphasize it in one of the other goal statements.
Yeah, I think that's probably the better way to do it.
Yeah.
'Cause I think the funding itself standalone it needs to not be diluted.
Yeah, exactly.
To Denise's point, I would say that something that we have started seeing a lot more is that there is not necessarily like a recognition that TDM and transportation as a whole is like such a huge contributor to the climate crisis. And so when we go out to, I'm talking really about institutional employers at this point in time, they're like, oh, well, we're working on recycling. And I'm like, that's great, but the world's on fire. So I sort of wonder if there's some sort of like elevate the role, the communications about the role of TDM in sustainability as well. Yeah. This is a huge promise, and I think it gets lost in like our day-to-day marketing about mode shift.
Yep, that's a good point too. I think that we got a lot of feedback about not making these goal statements too wordy and overly complex.
It's hard.
So some of this we can infuse into the next step, which will be the strategies discussion or the objectives. It's another way of saying the objectives piece. So I'll this and any other feedback we get today, I'll of course discuss with ARC. If something doesn't make itself in black and white in the goal statements, know that our next step is to drill down into how we make those actionable, so that, as an example, if it doesn't end up as a goal statement, it will become part of our thinking for strategies for the communications piece of this. But I think it's a very good point. And we did hear, it is reinforced with some of what we heard at the focus group discussions too, just about folks understanding and how they internalize TDM and transportation as part of the broader environmental conversation.
And then the other thing, I know Roz knows I'm going to say this, but like policy is such a huge driver of mode shift, and it feels like it's getting a little bit left out here in just the adoption across all of the governments of policy that is supportive of TDM.
You go back to the previous slide.
Sure. And as you're reading through these, just another quick reminder, this is really about sort of expanding the economic focus. So it's, less of a focus on, not less of a focus, but you're moving beyond just the 9 to 5 white collar commute, and you're looking at other different types of employment needs. This is about serving that full employment life cycle. So you can use TDM to get somebody back and forth from, a job training program is just as important as getting them back and forth to a job, because ultimately we want to land them in a sustainable job, right? And then this last goal being about improving those connections or filling those gaps where the transit system in particular might not be able to serve right away, but really partnering and identifying where those gaps are and getting those programs to leverage one another.
Tracy, I would say number 3 just screams equity there. When we think about the first mile, it's certainly regional, but when you think about warehousing and where the warehouses are, and we've seen that in videos that we've presented, that disconnect from between the bus stop and the actual warehouse. Oftentimes it's a mile or 2 for the individual to walk to finish out their commute in the morning. And so that's a really big one. And I know even in the IIJA, I saw some things pointing to these connectors as well. And so then we would want to like look to see how we can make these connections even to that.
So is my next question is, have we kind of rethought these with the IIJA?
I think they're right in line. You all
There
are.
anything missing in turn? I keep coming back to the EV part.
EV is probably the thing that's not resonating, but I think that goes along with sustainability. So I think that could certainly capture that.
Yeah, I think the IIJA philosophies are absolutely reflected in the discussions and these sort of refined goal statements. They are intentionally high level. We have avoided, key terms that might be in IIJA now, but might not be a focus. Well, they will be a focus, but they might not be as kind of hard hitting, or perhaps we see them as limiting 5 years from now, right? But I would say the tenets of equity, resiliency, sustainability, these are all very much, and were very much a part of our discussions with the focus groups, with staff, et cetera. So they are intended to, like I said, sort of steer the ship in that direction and make sure that ARC is ready to do all of that good work. I do think the specifics around, how do we integrate EV considerations, et cetera, will be part of the strategy discussion. And those will absolutely be a part of the plan. We have an equity analysis as an example that we will be doing as part of this work. So that's been a core component even before IIJA was approved. So I think they get us there. It's just a matter of how, targeted you want that language to be. In our first workshop, we got some feedback from several folks that the goal statements were almost too targeted. So we, loosened the reins a little bit. So I think it's a little bit of a balancing act. And if the detail doesn't come through here, it has to come through those strategy discussions that we're going to start actually with the ESOs here in the next couple of weeks.
Tracy, to that point too, John Bayles, you may have said this yesterday in our meeting, but we're hopeful, but this could last for 4 years, could last for 5, the IIJA. And so we want this to have maybe like a 5 to 7, even potentially a 10-year lifespan. So if we are more broad, if the IIJA ever changes because of new administration or whatnot, then we can continue on and we don't have to go in and retweak, the wording, because we really were trying to make it match. So we're making it match without necessarily making it look as though it matches word for word, if that makes sense.
I think the 6 you have are great. I like them all. Still do think there needs to be one that is towards climate change, because that is so much, with Project Drawdown and all of that kind of stuff that's going on. There's so much emphasis on ESG. All of that is actually resonating with a lot of the buildings and the employers right now, that I think that could be the goal that's a little bit more broad, that makes sure that all of this stuff does come up under it. It's the only thing that's really missing in the overall, kind of the environmental side is not in any of those goals. So I would kind of like to see a 7th one that addresses that.
Yeah, that's a good idea too. And if what you're seeing right now is that piece of it is resonating with your employers, that's could potentially be our hook, right? When we talk about serving new employers, reinvigorating current partners. So yeah, I think we'll have a conversation about that. I don't think we'll get any disagreement that there could be the addition of something more focused. Go ahead.
Gil Grodzinski has his hand up for you, please. Ask him his question.
Oh, Gil, did you have a question?
Yeah, can you all hear me? Because this is kind of neat with the hybrid. This is a TDM strategy, in my opinion, having this. So this is great.
I'm not sure if this is what he wanted. He made a comment as well, but his hand's been up for a while. Workforce development and job training would address EVs through training people for electrification.
Yes, it absolutely could. Another example of where we would want to get more specific on the strategy side. So, as Sabrina likes to say, this is kind of like the high level, what we want to do. And the next piece of this is how we want to do it.
Could y'all
Can you hear
not
me?
hear? Gil,
Can you hear me? Oh, okay.
we can hear him. Can y'all hear me?
Oh, so it's on our end.
We can't hear in here.
Okay.
Right, well, maybe he can type in if he had a subsequent question. I will, going back to Denise's point, I'm just thinking about this. It was, at our first workshop, we talked quite a bit about, it was interesting in our focus groups in particular. We did a lot of surveying on sort of what TDM means to you. A lot of these folks weren't transportation and certainly not TDM professionals. But like I said, they interfaced with the needs and the desired outcomes of TDM in a lot of ways. And it was interesting to see that the priority focus was much less on the environmental piece of this than economic mobility, I'd say, is the highest level, access and economic mobility. And for those of us that have been in the, working in this arena for 20 plus years, that's really interesting to see. It's not a bad thing. And that's probably a bit of why you see it softened here and should be put back in. Obviously, CMAQ as our core funding is focused exclusively on air quality and emissions improvement. But I think it's an interesting shift for the program. But again, it's not to take away from what's being done now. It's about how do we augment it to do more without losing sight of or reinventing the kind of strong wheels we have in motion right now. Anything else?
Okay, here's Gil's point. He said, my thoughts. If you add climate goal, that is good. If not, a separate goal would make sure it is understood in goals that none of the strategies and services do not impact inadvertently emissions adversely. So I know he was typing in a thought, but that's kind of his take on that. That, adding in a climate goal is good.
I think it's a broader climate, we've seen over the years, to the point you were talking about, it's air quality doesn't resonate with people anymore, but general climate does. So in the whole ESG stuff is kind of emerging. So I wouldn't be surprised that in the focus groups that a lot of the sort of everyday people aren't really aware of that, but it's the people making the investment decisions that are really becoming aware of it. So I think it's kind of an emerging thing that we want to just make sure we're ahead of.
Yeah, I think it's a really good suggestion. I'm more intrigued by that as the hook for these upcoming discussions on strategy, because ultimately, who cares what buzzword you use? It's about how can we do what we want to do through, your whatever is the hook to become a partner with you all.
Bill gives an instance. He gives a scenario. He says in Europe, they increased miles per gallon through diesel, but it increased PM emissions. And he said, good intentions, just have to have a check on it.
Yeah, I think in those types of specifics, we will become more targeted in our thinking when we develop the evaluation piece of this. So as a quick reminder, as part of the scope for this plan, whatever goals and strategies framework that we come up with, we will have an evaluation framework as well to make sure that at the highest level, we're moving the plan forward in a way that makes progress towards those goals, doesn't conflict against those goals, to Gil's point, and how do we do that? What are the best sort of measures to do that at the plan level? That itself will, support and hopefully nest within or become part of Casey's more refined evaluation framework at the strategy and implementation level. So we can start to marry those two together.
This is another thought that's totally different. With ARC being, basically a conglomeration of local governments, should there be a goal in here that's really focused at that local government role? The kind of, to Shayna's point of having policies in everything that needs to be supportive of TDM? Is that something, to make this, I feel like those goals are definitely targeted at ESOs, but that's more of one that would be targeted as ARC wide, representing the membership that y'all focus on.
Personally, I think we did have a local, kind of economic development, local group focus group discussion. That was one of our topics for one of the focus groups that we had. It is very much a part of our thinking. My knee-jerk reaction to that is that will and might be best served again through the strategy piece of this. Because if we kind of do that for the local side, I'd want to compliment on the state side, or just something that tackles the different jurisdictional components of what we're trying to do with TDM services. So I'm almost in trying to keep it streamlined. I think let's tackle that through strategy. So if we have one, we don't have to have another. But again, we'll discuss with ARC, but I will tell you that is very much a part of the thinking. Drilling down at the local level and making these services resonate more with different types of local partners, making it a part of the policy discussion. And then I think, again, conversely at the state level, how do we do that, particularly with IIJA and some momentum around TDM? How do we do that at the state level as well?
Spot on. There is a tremendous opportunity through the IIJA for local and county governments to be funded along all of these conversations. And in my little mind yesterday is started thinking that TDM, plans and strategies like that CAP worked on with CAP worked on with the city of Atlanta, that it could be an opportunity for other cities to work on similar projects and have the resources to be able to do that, but we work alongside and work with them to get that done. So you're right on point there.
And I'll add that I see in goal 4 and specifically goal 4 and 5, a lot of opportunity for strategy development to highlight the role of local government. And really, if we're being honest, the same thing with the sustainability conversation, right? You can kind of go through each of these goals and say, perhaps we plan to create at least one strategy for each of these goals as they relate to sustainability or climate, and local governments as partners. So again, it's really difficult to find goals that's gonna cover the umbrella of things, and so that's where the how gets pulled out and teased out in the strategy development process, which is nuts.
And I'll make a plug we're going to start that in earnest at our interviews that we're trying to schedule with the ESOs, and then subsequently with a round of employers in April and May. And then our June workshop, which will be the second workshop for the plan. To date, it has been a little, we've just had to be presenting the research that we've been doing behind the scenes, et cetera, that sort of thing. The foundational pieces of the plan. I feel like we're shifting to the point where we're putting meat on the bones, and we really want to move the conversation forward. And that's really the strategy and the implementation piece. So we are going to start that at the second workshop in June. So please come and participate, hopefully in person. We'll be here, right, Roz? Yeah.
And take transit when you come.
Okay, thank you.
Let's thank Tracy, Sabrina, and everyone. I want to thank Jill. Jill, she's quiet over there, but Jill works tirelessly to help pull these meetings together, and she helps craft the agenda and gets the speakers. And so I just want to acknowledge her today as well. Thank you so much, Jill, for your hard work and your great work with this. And I do want, just by way of announcements, our next meeting is June 21st. And before that, though, as Tracy mentioned, we will be going out to meet with the ESOs, the employer service organizations That's made up of the 6 TMAs and Georgia Commute Options. So Denise, we're coming back to you and looking forward to hearing some more. This has really been really good insight, and I really enjoy hearing all of the comments regarding the direction that we're headed in. If you have any other ideas, feel free to email Sabrina and she can, add any thoughts if you have something after the meeting today. And I believe that's it. Are there any other announcements, Jill, that we need to cover? Is there anything else?
I think that's it.
All right. Well, we want to thank you all for your attendance today, and we're going to give you back a little bit of time. You have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everybody.